September 13th, 1986, on the Mall, here in the Land of Lakes country in Minneapolis. And it's a jazz weekend, and among the luminaries shining from the stand, Clark Terry, it's good to see you.
Good to be here, Leigh, and good to see you. Thank you.
Well, you've been here on many a field trip, and this is the mid-continent, but I think that your current activities at the academic side in clinics and stimulating students to learn is a fascinating area in your career, and I thought maybe we just might touch on that. What sort of learning strategies do you use in stimulating students to learn?
Well, one thing is to instill confidence in them, to let them know that if anybody else did it, they can do it. It's like ABC, any boy can, or any girl can, or whatever. So we, first of all, get the confidence of the kids and let them know that those of us who are imparting the knowledge to them are human beings, and we're not trying to look down upon them. We're just on the same level with them and trying to just sort of on an equal basis to discuss things and talk things. And we find that this is a very good system for teaching kids, because sometimes too often, I think, in some of the establishments of learning, the kids are browbeaten, and as you got to do this, you must do this, and so much so till the kids sort of hate to face these people when they go to class. They hate the subject that they're being taught. So we want them to love jazz, and we want them to realize that it's a beautiful thing, something that they can live with and love and make other people happy and make themselves happy with, and something that they shouldn't fear. So this is the approach that we've found. It's a very, very successful approach to use to kids, and it works good.
We're only a short distance from the campus of the University of Minnesota, and you've been a group leader along with Dr. Frank Ben-Cresciuto and his staff, and certainly in that situation you've applied just what you've described. What did you discover here in Minnesota that might be different from, say, other learning process in other schools? Anything different at all?
Well, not necessarily so much different than any other place, except that we found that there were some extremely talented kids. One comes to mind, a gentleman by the name of Barnett, I think Steve Barnett, and he was, this was like 10, 15 years ago, maybe even longer. He was an outstandingly talented young man in those days, and so much so that there weren't too many people around who were professionals who could do what he did any better than he was doing it. And there were a number of kids in that field, with that type of talent. But Leigh, we find that in every area in this country and in many other parts of the world, there's always some extremely outstanding kids, people who decided that they were going to persevere and just had enough stick-to-itiveness to really dig in and get involved in the thing that we stress, that they can't settle for mediocrity and they must rise above the heap. And we find that this happens in all parts of the area, all areas rather, in all parts of the world. And this area here is just one thing I will say. I think Dr. Ben is really greatly responsible for it. They really turn out and they really learn, and they really all over the world you see products of Dr. Ben-Cresciuto, and I think that's because of his easygoing manner, which is more or less the same technique that we spoke about before. He doesn't browbeat the students into, you got to do this. He just sort of lets the knowledge ooze into them and ooze out of him into them, and they when they get it, they've got it, and it's there forever. So an awful lot of students from this area like that, as against some areas where more hard-nosed kids. Okay, show me something, The kids are a little more open here, and I find that to be true in areas that are particularly away from the big cities. I guess there's a reason for that.
Once upon a time, the learning environment, at least in this art form, was one-on-one and or in a group with the scale of a big band. And you were touring and you were learning, and that was the way it was, or you were in a jam session.
Right.
And certainly that was the history of it. As you began to learn and break in, what opened the door for you? Is there anything special?
Well, as you mentioned before, we, when I was a young kid coming along, the only means of getting the knowledge was to absorb it through the medium of just sitting by or being around the people who were endowed with whatever it was necessary to do to be associated with the interpretation of the jazz language, and sort of just have it passed on like masonry from word to mouth. It's sort of osmosis. You just soaked it up by being there. There were no ways and means of documenting these things in those days, and there's still some that they can't do. You can't put in a book how to say do. You can't put that in a book. So some of it has to be done by word. However, one of the things that makes it better, and sort of answers partial answer to your question, better for imparting the knowledge nowadays, is that they have come up with many ideas and ways and means of documenting the things where the kids can read it and study it and get a better idea of it. So there's an awful lot of literature now that is available to students as compared to what was available when I was a kid or when you were a kid. And that it was almost unheard of in those days. Things to read about, how to play jazz, how to get involved with the interpretation of the jazz language. So the perpetuation of our craft was left up to those who were conscientious enough to stay involved and just take the hard knocks and listen and be really interested in enough in it to really want to overcome the obstacles.
Was there any particular turning point for you where you found yourself making a true transition and evolution and more mature ability to execute what you were doing?
As far as playing? Well, I think it just happens so gradually and little by little, and just through the results of conscientious effort and lots and lots of practice, which I stress. And sometimes you just don't know. You can't really put your finger on when it's happening, but if you practice regularly, it's constantly benefiting you. And you'll find that the passages that you found difficult to make last year are a lot easier to make this year if you practice. However, if you don't practice, you'll find passages that you found difficult to make last year are impossible to make this year. So practicing is the key word, And I think when you do that, when you're conscientious about it, and you really, really sincerely indulge in real serious practice, I mean, real, not just entertaining. Some people take out their instruments and just entertain themselves and play everything they know instead of playing things that they don't know. When you practice, you're supposed to sound bad because you don't know how to do what it is that you're trying to do until you have mastered it. And then when you've mastered that, you don't settle for that. You don't say, well, now I've got it. You tackle something else that you know you can't do. And there's one little thing that we always try to stress to kids. It's so easy for a student to fall into what we colloquially refer to as a groove. Sometimes a person will feel very, very content with what he's doing. He says, I got it all under my skin. I got it in my pocket. It's all right there. I don't have to worry about it. And when he reaches this stage, he's what we refer to as grooving, and that means he's satisfied, And we find that the only difference between a groove and a grave are the dimensions.
Clark, Terry, that's a marvelous view of this learning process. Thanks ever so much for taking time out on a Saturday afternoon in the month of September in the year 1986 here in Minneapolis.
My pleasure, Leigh. Thank you very kindly.